We've all been told that from a distance, Earth appears as a greenish-blue dot. But being a bit of a space traveler myself, I know this isn't always true, especially if you happen to be approaching from head-on at around midday. In this case, you'll notice one more color painting the planet's surface, a sprawling sandy yellow expanse, what those below call the Sahara Desert. Falling right in the middle of the Afro-Eurasian landmass, this desert has acted as a barrier for people throughout the ages, and in doing so has played a key role in shaping the course of all of human history. As a result of its tremendous size and historical impact, the Sahara is now one of the most well-known geographic features on this planet, and to many it represents the epitome of arid landscapes. However, despite its fame, very few people truly understand the underlying geography that governs this vast space. While many see only a single scathing feature upon the Earth's surface, in practice the Sahara is a complex land of its own, containing entire mountain ranges separated by seas of sand. These are the landforms that have defined chapters of human history, at times keeping entire empires at bay. Yet many of the names of these landforms and their true significance remain obscure, even to me, a self-described Atlas Pro. So today I'd like to fix that by taking a closer look at this vast desert from above, to see what new insights we can gain into this land and its history through studying the geography of the Sahara. Okay, so let's start with the basics. Due to its shape and the way it orbits our sun, the Earth has an atmospheric circulation pattern that causes consistently warm, wet air to rise near the equator and warm, dry air to fall near the tropics. This has produced lush rainforests along 0 degrees latitude, but large deserts on either side of them as well, including the Sahara. My point in telling you this is so that you can see how this part of Africa isn't like inherently desert or anything, but rather it only happens to be desert because of the continent's position relative to the equator. If Africa was any further north, this desert would be much smaller. If it was any further south, this area could have been a massive rainforest. But because of where this landmass sits, the largest portion of it just so happens to fall within this desert zone. What I hope this reveals is that the Sahara isn't a single place, it's a whole half of a continent containing several different regions that have all been thrust into this arid zone together. Or in other words, the Sahara isn't one big desert, but it's more like 6 or 7 big deserts that are all right next to each other. And that's my main reason for wanting to make this video, as this huge expanse is too often viewed as a simple, featureless place, rather than a complex series of regions. So that's what we'll be familiarizing ourselves with today, the individual geologic units that constitute this land. Though before we get started, we need one more beginner lesson in desert terminology. Without any vegetation to hold soil to the surface, most of it gets blown away by the wind until it settles in natural basins. If an area is dry enough, sand will fill local depressions over time, creating flat plains of sand situated between rocky uplands. This is the layout of basically every desert on Earth. Sand erodes from the high spots and collects in the low spots. Once captured within a basin, sand rarely leaves, but instead the near constant winds blow these shifting sands around into waves or dunes. These landforms are known as ergs, a word originating from Arabic that literally translates to dune field, and are probably what most of you first think of when picturing a desert, as they're pretty iconic. Though what I find most interesting about ergs is that because sand flows similarly to a liquid, in a lot of ways ergs, or bodies of sand, tend to mirror bodies of water. For example, ergs typically fill in the bottoms of basins the same way rainwaters do in wetter places, which means you will literally find ergs in the same places you'd otherwise expect to find lakes, often even taking the exact same shape a lake in this position would have. This becomes particularly noteworthy when you take the African humid period into account, because as recently as 6,000 years ago, this very same land was inundated with water, and many of the basins that are ergs now actually were lake beds. Another perhaps even more obvious resemblance between ergs and bodies of water are the wave patterns that form on their surface as a result of wind blowing over them. Waves like these occur whenever two fluids of different viscosities flow over one another, so to see the winds creating these patterns in the sand hopefully serves as another illustration of how similar bodies of sand or ergs are to bodies of water. In fact, we could even go one step further and suggest that ergs also act as substantial barriers the same way oceans do, often isolating whatever lands poke above their surface. This really only happens in the highland areas, where the underlying bedrock rises above the sand level. Where this occurs, the stone mountainside is blasted by scathing winds until all that remains is a windswept plain of rock. This pavement of stone and boulders forms an equally harsh desert landform known as reg. I know, erg and reg, that's kinda confusing. Don't blame me, I didn't invent the Arabic language, but it might be easier to remember as sand and stone. Although reg landscapes are perhaps less iconic than sprawling sand dunes, they're actually far more common, being what results when everything else has been stripped away from the land. In fact, the vast majority of the Sahara has been degraded into this desert pavement, whereas dune fields only cover about a quarter of its surface. All that's left is our third and final desert landform, what's known as Hamadas. These are the places so exposed to the sandblasting winds that they've been stripped down to their very bedrock, leaving behind only a solid, impenetrable surface. This only really happens where full mountains stand above the landscape, exposed to the elements, creating islands of bare stone surrounded by seas of sand. As a result, the mountainous regions often appear much darker than the rest of the desert, making them clearly visible even from space. This dark coloration can often make these mountains even hotter than the light desert sands, and their brutal stone surfaces make them nearly impossible for plant life to take hold in, making these mountaintops just as barren as the ergs and reg. However, sheltered between the harsh mountainsides are the secluded valleys, or wadis. Here, the landscape channels any groundwater towards the center of the valley, allowing them to sustain the occasional tree or shrub. The rock faces can also create shade, offering some of the only true escape from the intense desert sun. Together, this makes the mountains by far the most and really only habitable spaces within the Sahara. And something interesting happens when you treat just the mountains as livable here. Suddenly, the Sahara transforms from one large barren wasteland into an ocean of sand full of scattered islands, each one a refuge from the scorching sun. The largest of these rocky outcrops is this roughly triangular one right here, known as the Tibesti Mountains. Covering 80,000 square kilometers, this range forms an isolated region of its own, roughly the same size as the island of Ireland at the heart of the Sahara. Here, old volcanoes stand against the ravages of sandblasting erosion, leaving a brutalist landscape where only the largest stones survive. Yet even in a place as extreme as this, there's life to be found hidden within the wadis, where ephemeral streams run. Although water rarely lasts long on the surface here, once it enters the soil as groundwater, it can remain here for thousands of years, only accessible to certain trees and other deep-rooted vegetation. Although this still isn't much, the meager plant life here makes even these mountains seem like paradise compared to the truly desolate ergs that surround this land. In fact, the shelter and resources provided by the Tibesti Mountains has even supported people living here for the past few thousand years. Over this time, the isolation and extreme conditions of the Tibesti Range has caused those living here to develop their own unique language, customs, and sense of identity, giving rise to the Tobu people, an ethnic group completely native to these mountains. You might even remember us learning about them while studying this 1864 map of Africa, and this is where things come full circle, as the reason this area was so surely acknowledged as the country of the Tibu or Tida during a time when the rest of the Sahara was empty and unexplored is because even all the way back then, these mountains were well known for having created an isolated patch of habitable land where a distinct people lived, and this old map is a testament to that. Don't you see, we're just getting started, yet we already observing how the geography of this land directly affects where and how people in this region live. Though what's perhaps most exciting about revealing these habitable highlands comes from learning that the Tobu people of the Tibesti Mountains are not alone in this arid arena, and in fact, every large collection of rocks have attracted their own idiosyncratic populations. Southeast of the Tibesti Mountains, for instance, is the Ennedi Massif, another large highland area that breaches above the sand. Though not quite as expansive as the Tibesti, Ennedi Massif is another series of sharply eroded rocks, featuring many sand-blasted canyons that create a landscape of stark contrasts. The valley walls often form complex channels directing water into hidden coves deep within the mountains, where small pools can stay wet year-round. While you might just call it an oasis, the technical term for this is a Guelta, and where they occur, they attract both plants and animals, creating small pockets of life wedged between the steep walls of these hills. Perhaps the most famous Guelta in the world can be found in the lower section of these mountains, between these two massive cliffs. Known as the Guelta de Archi, this name likely doesn't ring any bells, but if I showed you a picture of it, chances are you might recognize it from a nature documentary or something, as this Guelta tends to attract all sorts of desert life, and as such has become a popular destination for film crews and tourists alike. The way this Guelta works is simple and determined entirely by geography. You see, this area here serves as the catchment zone for any rain. As this water flows downhill, these rocks act as a funnel, channeling any and all moisture into this narrow corridor. This creates a local excess of groundwater, causing it to spill out onto the surface, creating a miraculous lake snaking between these sheer desert cliffs. Beyond this bottleneck, the water flows out and back into the ground, supporting a trail of vegetation along its route until drying up completely. Altogether, this reinforces how seemingly inhospitable rocks can actually harbor small pockets of livable conditions, which has in turn invited people into these valleys as well. Historically known as the Zagawa, the people living within the corridors of the Ennedi Massif have also developed into a distinct ethnicity of their own over the past few thousand years in isolation within these desert mountains. However, not all highlands are populated like this. For example, to the north of the Tibestis is another dark landform poking out from above the sand. This is the Harouge volcanic field, a remarkably new feature on this planet. Having started erupting only 6 million years ago, in that time an igneous platform over 23,000 square kilometers has been constructed over the dunes. Had this volcanism taken place 200 miles due north in the Mediterranean, it could have built an island roughly the same size as Sardinia, but instead it ended up paving a mound of dark igneous rock in the middle of the Sahara to be absolutely scorched in the desert sun, creating a truly scalding hot landscape that no human or any other form of life can tolerate for long. Despite sitting above the sand, this structure isn't tall enough to provide any shade or catch any moisture passing overhead, leaving this land high and dry. And because of this, the Harouge remains a mostly uninhabited volcanic plain at the heart of this great desert. For more habitable lands, we need to look further to the west, where we'll find another collection of mountain ranges. The southernmost of these are the N'Ajjer Mountains. Although these two appear as barren rocky plateaus from above, a closer look will reveal numerous wadis with brief corridors of green, providing another respite from the sun and sand. As such, the valleys sheltered within these mountains have also attracted and supported people for the past few thousand years, producing another distinct ethnic group known as the N'Ajjer or Aspen people. You might remember they too were mentioned on this old map, as these mountains have also long been known to harbor a populace of their own. Above that are the Hoggar Mountains, where many nomadic Tuareg people live. The largest concentration of people can be found in this sheltered valley basin where the city of Tamanrasset lies. Over 140,000 people live here in the center of the Sahara Desert, supported entirely by an oasis harbored within this protected wadi. Once again, these mountains are famous for their sharp erosive landscape, given to them over thousands of years of being blasted by biting sands. However, these mountains weren't always this way, and in fact, back during the African humid period, the Hoggar Mountains received enough water to supply a river that flowed for over 1,000 miles all the way to the Atlantic. This ancient lost river was only rediscovered within the past few years and has since been named the Taman Rasset River after the main city within these mountains, which you might remember I made a whole video about as well. Directly north of the Hoggar Mountains, even deeper into the Sahara, are the Tassili N'Ajjer Mountains. Being this far into the interior, very little moisture reaches these mountains, even compared to surrounding ranges, and as a result, today Tassili N'Ajjer is a much less populated mountain range than the nearby Hoggar Mountains. The area does still see the occasional nomadic Tuareg herders, but for the most part there are no long-term settlements here. However, this too wasn't always the case. If we again think back to when the Sahara was green, these mountains were home to large numbers of people, perhaps more than anywhere else in the region. We know this because these mountains contain more works of ancient human art than just about anywhere else in the world. Over 15,000 paintings and carvings have been found here, dating as far back as 12,000 years, not only giving testament to the once booming population of these mountains, but also providing us with a record of the kinds of animals that were once found alongside them here. In fact, the cave paintings found within the Tassili N'Ajjer Mountains are actually what first clued us into the African humid period, as they are what caused people to realize there was once a time when people lived here alongside elephants and giraffes. Our very understanding of this desert's green past started here, and together these are some of the most invaluable glimpses we have into ancient human life. Though unfortunately, given the extreme climate and remoteness of these mountains, they're also quite difficult to search, meaning there are likely loads more of these sorts of works yet to be found. Seriously, if you're into archaeology but think there's nothing left to discover, I promise you there are countless undiscovered artworks hidden within these mountains still waiting to be uncovered. So have at it, please. From here, looking even further west brings us to the Atlas Mountains, whoop whoop, which define the edge of the Sahara. On the other side of them lie the only truly green valleys in all of North Africa and falls outside of our area of focus for today. Together, we can see how the Sahara is not simply one large expanse of sand, but rather features a collection of lands, each one isolated by vast sand seas. And now that we're familiar with the lands that poke out from the sands, it's finally time to learn about the sands themselves. Perhaps the largest and most famous erg is the one directly south of the Mediterranean Sea. Accordingly, in English, this is only known as the Grand Erg, though sometimes its size causes it to be broken into the Grand Erg Occidental and the Grand Erg Oriental. We can better understand why from space, where we can see these two bodies of sand sharply divided by a rocky plateau. Positioned just beyond the Atlas Mountains and Libyan coast, this is the erg ancient explorers most often encountered when trying to push deeper into the continent. Whether it was the Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Romans, Umayyads, Ottomans, or so on, whenever a Mediterranean empire tried exploring further south, these are the sands that stopped them. Because of this, the Grand Erg is probably the most historically consequential of all of the Sahara's mini dune fields, being the barrier that kept most people from venturing onto the other side of the continent. Not to mention, the sand dunes here are absolutely ginormous, visible from space even. And this has an interesting effect, as it not only shows us where the lowlands are, but the dunes also reveal what direction the wind most often travels. Following this wind pattern will lead us west, where sands feed into another basin, the Erg Iguidi. This sea of sand is almost entirely contained by the Anti-Atlas Mountains to the north, creating another bowl-shaped basin that's gradually filling with material. The southern end of this erg is defined by this massive plateau of rocky Reg, El Eglab Massif. Not quite mountainous, yet tall enough to shrug off most desert sand, this leaves a sprawling stone plain just barely keeping sands from pouring over it. Without steep cliffs providing shade or directing groundwater, this highland area is exposed to the harsh desert conditions and consequently is equally as barren as the Ergs. Beyond this, there are few mountains to contain the sand, and so the land opens up into the vast erg of El Djouf. Without any real terrain to shape this basin, El Djouf forms one of the largest, flattest, and driest plains on the planet. From here, winds blow directly into the Atlantic Ocean, meaning this is the end of the line for Saharan sands, unless they get blown all the way to South America. Though looking east, even more ergs lie deeper inland. The central mountains of the Sahara support a huge expanse of rocky reg, but on the southern side of them is another low area where sand has collected, forming the erg of Bilma. This sea of sand stretches all the way from the Hoggar Mountains to Ennedi Massif, and at the very bottom of this basin you may notice the sand visibly lightens to a dusty white color. This is the Bodele depression. Once again, because sand flows downhill just like water, ergs tend to form in the same places water would collect in rainier circumstances. So it should come as no surprise that during the African humid period, this Bilma basin collected rainwater and filled up into what's now called Lake Megachad. Crazy how they named a whole lake after me, I know, but trust me, this name was appropriate, as it would have been by far the largest body of water on the continent, so large in fact that the deepest remnants of this lake persist into modern times in the form of regular Lake Chad. During this wet period, however, microscopic sea creatures known as diatoms thrived in this lake, and when they died, they would fall to the lake floor, their empty shells stacking atop one another to form a layer of sedimentary rock. Without this water, however, this basin has dried up, exposing this diatomaceous earth to the nearly constant winds, where it's easily eroded back into microscopic dust particles and carried away. In fact, of all the Saharan dust that reaches South America, it's estimated that around half of it originates here alone, earning the Bodele Depression recognition as the dustiest place on Earth. This sand is contained by the Ennedi Massif to the east and the Tibesti Mountains to the north, but on the other side of these mountains, the more chaotic landscape has produced a series of smaller pools of sand. The Erg Isawain, the Erg Ubari, and the Erg Murzuk, each contained separately within the reg landscape. While this might be a little hard to see on maps like this, from space these ergs are quite easy to tell apart, thanks to their red sands contrasting against the dark mountains and tannish reg. Seeing them from above also allows us to better understand how the rocky terrain keeps these bodies of sand apart from one another. Further east, there's a lot of highland reg built up from volcanic activity, and it's not until we get to the other side of the Harouge that we'll find one last erg. This one is known as the Great Sand Sea, which I think is funny because this whole time I've been describing these as seas of sand, only for that to end up actually being the name of one, so now I feel vindicated for calling them that. Stretching from Libya to Egypt down into Sudan, this is another historically relevant desert, as it also stood as an obstacle for numerous empires and civilizations trying to penetrate deeper into the continent. From this point, the sands reveal wind patterns most consistently blowing south, funneling sand through these rocks where it ends up either in the Bilma Erg or in this area of the Libyan desert. Beyond the Great Sand Sea, the far eastern reaches of the Sahara rise back into elevated plains known as the Red Sea Hills, keeping the sands contained within and completing our picture of this desert. By now, I hope we can all recognize that the Sahara is not simply one big sandpit, but rather a series of interconnected highlands and lowlands. While this might seem trivial today, knowing how to navigate between ergs and regs was, and in some cases still is, an essential part of life for some people. And as such, this insight into the layout of the land can help us better understand the history of those who have lived here. For example, let's imagine you have a bunch of African goods that you'd like to sell in Arab markets on the other side of the Sahara. While you might initially think to charge straight ahead, as we now understand this would bring you straight into a large and ever-changing erg. Not only are the dune fields exposed to the elements, offering no shade or shelter, but the very act of walking through sand takes more energy than walking across a solid surface, which is especially important if you're trying to cross thousands of miles of desert on foot. Together, the exposure and energy required to traverse ergs often makes them too difficult or too dangerous for most travelers. Once again, the shifting sands can be thought of as similar to bodies of water, preventing people from walking straight through them, and instead must be circumvented. Now we can see that trying to avoid the ergs leaves only a few good routes to cross this desert. Probably the easiest and safest route would be to follow the Nile all the way, but this isn't really an option for West Africans. On this side of the continent, it appears the best route starts right here. At this point, the Niger River makes a fortunate meander from the Ghanaian highlands deep into the desert before flowing south, offering the most reliable source of fresh water on this side of the Sahara. Then, from this starting position, you can walk on solid reg until you reach the Hoggar Mountains. From here, it's a quick trip to the Tassili N'Ajjer Mountains, and at this point you have two options. You could go west under the Grand Erg and over the Erg Igwiti into the Atlas Mountains, or you could cross between the Grand Erg and Erg Isawain to reach the Tripolitanian coast, and from there you could go all the way to Egypt. While this specific journey from the banks of the Niger to the Nile and beyond might seem almost pointless, this was the exact trip any Muslim person in West Africa had to embark on in order to complete their Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca, one of the necessary steps to get into the Muslim afterlife. This made knowledge of desert terrain and how to traverse it not only valued, but religiously vital, as in this case, being able to cross the desert quite literally equates to assuring a place in heaven. Not to mention, a fair amount of gold could be made by exchanging goods from either side of the desert, so this route also attracted caravans of traders and acted as the primary artery for both economic activity and cultural exchange in and out of West Africa. Altogether, this method for crossing the Sahara by navigating between its mountains and avoiding its ergs has been employed by people for thousands of years, and over that time, its usage has led to the rise of one of Africa's greatest cities, Timbuktu. It was from this hub that countless Muslim pilgrims and merchants began their journey to Mecca, most notable of all being the African king Mansa Musa, who famously stopped here before crossing the Sahara on Hajj, only to later return and expanded his empire to include this city in order to better connect himself to the Muslim world. Ultimately, given the natural geographic advantages of this position as a starting point to cross this desert, it makes sense this area has served as the seat of power for several African states over the ages, including both the Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire. However, now that Muslims can just fly to Mecca and African goods are shipped by boat everywhere, the importance of this cross-Saharan trade route has dwindled in the modern age, and as such, what was once the sprawling, rich city of Timbuktu has been reduced to only a small outpost at the edge of the desert. It's only by studying the underlying features of this land that we can come to understand the strategic importance of places like Timbuktu and how its position along the Niger once made it the gateway between sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of the world. Though now that we understand the terrain better and know where it's easier to move and where to avoid, it suddenly makes so much more sense why historical trade routes formed where they did and what places benefited from their geographic good fortune. Trust me, I could talk for days about all the different ways geography has affected the dynamics of this region, but I hope this has served as a good example of how breaking this region down into its component parts can reveal new insights into how it functions and help us better understand the story of this land. So even though I'm still not quite an expert at African history, learning the geography of the Sahara has definitely brought us one step closer. Hey everyone, before you head out, I'd like to remind you that I recently launched this map behind me as a new piece of channel merch. If you watched this far, chances are you enjoy spending time looking at maps of far-off desert lands. And what we have here is the furthest desert land of them all, Mars, with its lower elevations displayed in blue so that you get an intuitive sense of its highlands and lowlands. In a way, I guess you could even say this northern basin is just one big erg, while the southern highlands are mountainous reg, and Mars is one big desert planet. If this interests you and you'd like to explore the surface of Mars even more, there's a link in the description that'll take you over to my store. The proceeds go directly to filling up my fuel tank so we can keep going on flights like this. That's all I have for you today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all again very soon.
This is the Sahara Desert, a landmass of 6 million square miles, the largest in the world. It is a desert that is not only growing, but becoming more intensely dry.